And I'm curious, why has the Wolf of Wall Street gone all in on crypto, DeFi, and NFTs?
So originally, if you go back to the public statements I made on programs like CNN, CNBC, I was always, even in my most pessimistic times of crypto, I was always very much a believer in blockchain technology. What I was not high on was Bitcoin at 20,000 in 2017. I knew it was ripe for a massive fall, and I was exactly right. The thing crashed and burned. But where I was wrong was typically when something like that crashes and burns, it drops to zero. In this case, it crashed and burned, but still had a $3 billion market cap. And that made me pause and wonder, like, wait a second, I know the market so well. I know how these sorts of speculative assets trade. When they bust, they don't bust out at the 3 billion. They bust out to zero. So there had to be something there. And that was really kind of the first thing that really made me take a much closer look. Now, my thesis for why I hated Bitcoin so much had nothing to do with Bitcoin. In fact, it was because I thought it was so powerful. I'm like, there's no way the government's going to let this shit go. There's just no way. Like, to me, it was inconceivable that the United States, and by the way, I think if they could turn back the clock 8 years, they would turn it back in a second and squash this shit before it ever took hold. Right. Because now it's basically too late. But in the early days, I thought the U.S. would do what China did. But obviously a government like China, authoritarian government, can just shut things off because, Xi says it's done, it's done. It's not like that here. And I realized somewhere around in sort of mid-2019, a couple of things happened. Firstly, someone gave me a very different perspective and a different pitch on Bitcoin. I was hearing all these people, Bitcoin's going to 1 million. It's going to replace the dollar. And I'm like, just fucking stop. Because to me, what that meant was if you want to get idiots to keep crossing you out at higher and higher prices, when it hits 15,000, you can't say it's going to 25,000. That's not enough. The only way someone's going to keep buying it if you create these wild expectations. So unsophisticated investors will keep buying it even when it's 50,000. So there's this idea that the story circulating was so prominent back then is Bitcoin's going to 1 million. It's going to replace the dollar in 3 years. And I knew that was nonsense. But then what I wasn't hearing, and there was actually even more of it, I wasn't exposed to it because those people yell really loud. But the people that actually understood Bitcoin were like, stop it. It's never going to, it's not meant to replace the dollar, not anytime soon. But what this is digital gold. It's a store of value. And I got a very sober perspective from someone on Bitcoin, a guy named Robert Beatles, who you might know, a podcast, Beatles, right? And we became partners in an app out there. And once I started looking at it from that perspective and doing more research, and I saw people like Elon Musk. Now, it's not because like when people say, oh, Elon bought it, I'm not interested in that part, the hype part. I'm saying it was a bunch of people like that. I saw institutions actually started getting behind it. And I noticed that as the inroads into the mainstream financial system became more and more developed, I was like, there's going to be too much intersection for the government to say, done. I started realizing that it's not going to happen. I said, what's going to happen is they're going to heavily regulate Bitcoin versus trying to shut it down. Now, purists will say you could never shut it down, but I don't believe that's true. There was a time when I think they could have made it so undesirable and almost made it illegal. They could have really destroyed it and made it something that was in the fringes and, using for purposes it probably shouldn't be used for. Once it crossed to that point, I noticed the inroads into mainstream financial institutions. I said, it's going to get regulated. And one thing I do know, and I've been around many years, as you know, I'm older than I look, when things like Bitcoin or junk bonds or default swaps, things that were once not regulated, become regulated, almost always it's a massive boon for that sector. Because what happens is once regulation comes in, the bigger money can now safely invest. There is so much institutional money that's on the sidelines right now simply because there's no regulatory clarity. Yeah. Once regulatory clarity really comes in, I think it's going to be amazing. And it will also knock out the shitty motherfuckers who are destroying DeFi and the image of it by releasing these shit coins and doing things that they should not be doing, that they should go to jail for. And even that's come from me who went to jail for something like that by in my younger days, but I'm a little older and wiser now, okay? But it's giving the industry such a bad name from that, so that stuff's got to stop.
Yeah.
So that's where I stand right now.